Hello, and welcome to 10th week. So this is our last week of the quarter, if you can believe it. And we're going to start by picking up where we left off last time. So looking at some political history, political art, the end of the Tetrarchy, and the Ascension of Constantine. And then next time on Thursday, we'll be looking a little bit more at religious artwork. So today it's going to be a lot of politics, and then next time it'll be a lot of religion. So that's where we're headed, and then it'll be the end of the course. Amazing. So like I said, we're going to start off where we left off last time, which was with the Tetrarchy. So I kind of went through this last time. I don't want to go through it all again, but it is really important to know the historical context so that we can kind of understand what's happening here. But where we left off for now is that Constantine, who is the son of Constantius, so Constantius was the Western Tetrarch over here. He was initially the Caesar, and then he rose up into the Augustus position, but then he died fairly quickly. So when that happened, his legions declared his son, Constantine, as the successor to him. So they wanted him to be the Augustus. But there was already someone waiting in the wings. There was already somebody in that Caesar position, that junior position, who was slated to succeed Constantius. So that's what ends up happening. Galerius, who was kind of our senior Augustus in the East, makes sure that Severus becomes Augustus. But as a consolation prize, he gives Constantine the position of Caesar. So when he does that, Constantine takes control of the West, and he builds his capital at Trier. So you might remember from last time we were talking about Galerius building all of those things at Thessaloniki. So we start to see new centers of power rise up across the empire. It's not necessarily so Rome focused anymore because we don't just have one emperor anymore. So it's not like there's one guy ruling from Rome. Instead, we have four people, and they're ruling from all these different parts of the empire. And so each one of these parts needs its own capital. So Constantine, as emperor of kind of the Northwest, so kind of Britain and Gaul, and then someone else had Italy and Africa, but Constantine's kind of in the Britain, France, Germany area, so he's going to build his capital at Trier. And Trier, like a lot of cities that we've looked at, was an ancient city, so even before the Romans, it was founded by Celtic tribes, one in particular called the Treveri, and that's where we get Trier from. That's where that name comes from. But it was conquered by the Romans in the 1st century BC, fairly early on. And at this point, wasn't necessarily a huge city, but Constantine's going to come in after his father. His father had been there a little bit as well, and they're going to build up the city more into sort of an imperial headquarters, make it fit for a new emperor. And you can see it on the map there. Today it's right on the border of Germany and Luxembourg, also very close to France, and it's kind of gone back and forth over the years between German and French control. So the first thing we're going to look at is actually not something that Constantine built. It's something that was there before him, although he ended up kind of adding on to it and finishing it up. So it's the Porta Nigra, which means the Black Gate. You can tell, why it got that name, right, from the coloring on it. So it's part of the wall of Trier, a very defensive feature. So this is pretty much all that's left of it, but it would have connected to a larger wall that rang the city. And if you see on the left, so we're standing outside of the city. That's kind of the facade facing outward. And so we are facing in. It's like we're about to walk in. And then on the right, we're inside the city and we're about to walk out. So that's what you would see on your way out. It still survives today, as you can see, as the largest and oldest surviving Roman city gate north of the Alps. So kind of in all of the more northern part of Europe, not necessarily the Mediterranean, but Europe, it is the oldest gate that we have and the largest. But it's really a testament to the need to secure the northern frontier, right? So we've talked about that the West was a little bit more shaky. We have a lot of military campaigns happening there, more so than the East, it seems, although there definitely were some in the East. But the West was they were always dealing with these border issues in the West. And so this is kind of a representation of that, a reflection of that, that we see this massive gate being built, right? Because this is a huge gate. This is definitely something that you would build because you are worried about your city being invaded. This is not something that would be built in necessarily a time of peace. This speaks definitely to the kind of defensive needs of the city in its size, in its grandeur. It's very large and which is practical. So you could have your archers kind of out of those windows up top on the gates, like towers that we have. But it's also just very imposing. So if you are an enemy coming to attack this city, you might think twice because this is a pretty foreboding structure. And one of the reasons that it might feel that way is because it is rusticated. So it's made of rusticated stone. And we briefly mentioned this a while back. We talked about Claudius building the Porta Maggiore in Rome. And this was kind of the same thing where it's supposed to look old. It's supposed to feel not super sleek, not super modern. It's supposed to feel kind of clunky and heavy and very like voluminous. You know, this is like a sturdy structure that looks like it has stood for centuries, even though it hasn't. So it's supposed to feel very imposing, foreboding. It's supposed to kind of scare off enemies, you know, and portray the strength of Rome. So that's a deliberate choice to keep these stones kind of unfinished, kind of rough, because you want to show that kind of volume and solidity. And yeah, as much as it's a message to the invaders, the possible invaders, it also kind of provides a sense of security for the people living there, right? So if you are a resident of Trier, you might feel a little bit safer knowing that your government has built this giant gate. You might feel like, okay, I'm safe, right? So it kind of works both ways, a measure of security for the residents, as well as a sort of warning or defensive feature against enemies. Next up, we have the imperial baths in Trier. So these were begun by Constantius, who was Constantine's father, and he was the initial Augustus and Caesar before that in the region. So he started this imperial bath complex, something that we've really seen, especially in this, getting into this late antique period. So Diocletian is building his, well, first it started with Caracalla building his baths. And then Diocletian is going to build baths of his own in Rome, these massive structures, which combined, you know, traditional bathhouse type things. So frigidarium, tepidarium, caldarium, but it's also going to have these places for more artistic endeavors, things that work your mind. So you're bettering your mind and your body. So we see Constantius getting in on the trend. He's going to build kind of a giant imperial bath complex in Trier. He actually dies before it's finished, and then Constantine takes over, and it also doesn't get finished under Constantine. It would have been very large in plan, very ornate, and so it maybe was a little bit overly ambitious to get accomplished. So we don't see it get finished, but it probably was finished in some capacity and was actually used. And then we actually see it being used as barracks for soldiers later on, a couple of centuries later. So still kind of a functional building, but didn't quite achieve the ultimate grandeur that Diocletian and Caracalla did with actually finishing their baths. But next up, we have perhaps the most important feature of Trier and something that is very closely associated with Constantine. So Constantine, as this new emperor in the West, he's creating his imperial headquarters, and so he needs to build kind of things to govern, buildings to govern in. And so this is one of the things he builds. It's called the Aula Palatina, which means audience hall. And you'll notice that it looks a lot like a basilica, right? So very long rectangular shape, and then it has that rounded apse at the end. And that's because it kind of had the same features, or the same function, I should say, as a basilica, as a traditional Roman basilica. It was kind of a administrative building or a place for Constantine to hold court, to receive guests, you know, audience hall. So this idea of people going to visit the emperor, to speak with the emperor. He would always sit in that apse, so that rounded area is the space that he would sit in. And then, you know, it's a practical building because it can hold a lot of people, right? So it's sheer size. Today it's a church, so that's why you have the cross and the chairs set up. So not like that in Constantine's time, more of an administrative building, but you can see how many people it would have held. And that's really important if you are receiving guests, if you're holding court, you want a building that can hold a lot of people. So yes, as I said, he would sit in the apse. That was kind of his space. If we start looking at it more formally, so we'll look at the exterior first. So we have a plain brick exterior. But it does have these 2 stories of windows, which is kind of interesting because it's not a 2-story building. So we have 2 stories of windows, but only one giant space. So we're kind of trying to make it feel larger by adding that 2nd story of windows, you know, to really elevate the height, kind of emphasize its verticality in this building, right? Make it feel taller. The windows, if we go also just on the trend of windows, so that's looking at the windows from the outside, and you can see them on the inside. And if we look at the apse where Constantine would have sat, you'll see that the windows on this smaller or on this row are smaller than the windows up top. So there's a change in size of the windows as we move upward. And that's kind of a visual trick to make Constantine look bigger. So if we have giant windows up top, and then we have smaller windows below, and then Constantine is sitting in front of those smaller windows, he's going to look bigger because you would kind of assume that the windows are the same size. And so in relation to the windows, he's bigger as it compares to the ones above, if that makes sense. So you're tricked into thinking that they're the same size, and then you're thinking, wow, Constantine is massive because look at how much space, he takes up next to the window, but the windows are actually smaller on the bottom. So he's not actually that giant, but he kind of wants you to think that he is. So kind of a little bit of a trick there. And then we also, kind of on the note of verticality again, the windows you can see are also recessed. So especially on the exterior, you can see it a little bit on the interior, but it's really emphasized on the exterior, the way that they're set back. So we have these kinds of piers here, and then the windows are inset from that. So that's also kind of causing a sense of verticality because you have this depth as well. So it emphasizes the vertical lines that are in between the windows are kind of pushed outward. They're really emphasized. So by the windows being set back, the vertical lines there are emphasized. And so that also makes the building feel taller. So we're all about size. We're trying to impose ourselves, if we are Constantine, trying to make a statement about our grandeur, about our kind of influence in the area, our power, right? We're doing all these things by creating such a large building and really emphasizing the largeness of it. What else? So on the interior, yes, one single room. The apse also would have had a mosaic, so it would have been covered in mosaic, again, kind of lavish, emphasizing the figure of Constantine who would be sitting there. And then the interior walls would have been lined with marble. So a nice space inside, worthy of an emperor. And also the whole building was heated by a hypocaust system. So we've talked about hypocausts with baths. That's the way that the water in the rooms would be heated to certain temperatures. But this building also had a hypocaust, which might make sense because we are in Germany, so we're a little bit more north. It's a little bit colder the more north that you go in Europe. So if you're going to be hanging out in this building a lot, you probably want to be warm. So they kind of had like a heating system, a central heating system. And then the last thing is the roof. So if you look at the top, we kind of have a little bit of a coffered ceiling, but it's all made of wood. So it's not concrete ceiling or a marble ceiling or anything like that. It's a wooden timber roof. So it has this timber framing and then those coffers. And this is actually something that we've seen at some other basilicas. So the Basilica Ulpia at the Forum of Trajan also had a wooden coffered roof. So it's kind of a simpler in a way. It's not as grand as concrete vaulting, right? So we don't have like a groin vault or even a barrel vault. We just kind of have wooden coffering. But we start to see this kind of more, especially in the late antique period. So, maybe a sign of declining wealth, something like that, that they couldn't quite afford or have the resources to build as impressive as a roof as some other structures. And then if we kind of take the whole city into consideration here, you can see the Aula Palatina up here, so that's what we were just looking at. And in Constantine's time, it would have been part of his whole palace that he built at Trier. So today, the later medieval folks built over his palace, and the bishop's palace, I believe, is there now, and it might just be a kind of a historic building now, but you can see this definitely later construction, but that sits on the site of Constantine's palace. So he would have had this kind of imperial whole giant palace for himself, and then he's got his administrative building where he can do his work right nearby. So this is all his space in Trier. He's got room to live, room to work, room to bathe. He's got it all. All right, so if we continue kind of looking at the historical context here, so how does this all work out? Because right now at Trier, Constantine is still a tetrarch, right? So he's one of four. He is not the sole emperor. He's one of four. The tetrarch system is working. You can remember we celebrated the 10th anniversary a while ago. Things are good after the 3rd century crisis. We started to achieve a little bit of stability, which is kind of exciting. However, that's not going to last long. So I'm about to throw a lot of history at you, and you don't have to remember every detail, but just kind of think about the way that things are unfolding here, and kind of the general players and how things are unfolding. So it's okay if you don't know every detail, but just kind of pay attention to how the artwork really plays into this political history that's happening at the time. So I'm just going to go ahead to this one actually. So if we start with 305, so 305 is when Diocletian and Maximian retire, and those are, they were founders of the Tetrarchy. They've decided to step down. In 306, the successor to Maximian, Constantius, who we've talked about, father of Constantine, dies, and we've kind of been through this. His son Constantine tries to succeed him, gets the position of Caesar as well instead. So that's where we're at. And when he's building Trier, we're in this tetrarchy still. And you can see that kind of represented on the coins. So this is a coin of Constantine that was minted in London, which was a city under his reign, that was under his kind of corner of the empire. It dates to around 307, and you can see here that he is looking very traditional. This looks like a lot of other coins that we've seen, I think. So it's kind of a solid, stable image. We have him in profile. He looks calm, he looks in control. He has the laurel on his head, so he's, has this ancient sign of sort of royalty, something that dates back to all the way to classical Greece, these laurels that important figures would get. And then we also see, on the back, we see him on horseback, and then there's sort of a barbarian enemy under the foot of the horse. So another kind of common scene that we've seen in other works of art, kind of the conquering of enemies. So a fairly standard coin that we see here during the Tetrarchy when Constantine is one of the four and things are kind of going as they should. All right, in 306, however, when Constantine becomes Caesar, someone else enters the stage. So Maxentius is the son of Maximian, and he is going to be jealous of Constantine because Constantine, after his dad dies, he gets the role of Caesar. And Maxentius is over here going, excuse me, when my father retired, I didn't get anything. So what's going on here? And so he feels a little bit of a sense of entitlement. He's definitely jealous of Constantine because he feels like he's in the same position. He's not understanding why he didn't get this kind of promotion. And, this kind of goes back to the issues that we've had in Rome for centuries of hereditary succession versus merit-based succession. And so I think we were trying to do a sort of more merit-based succession system with the Tetrarchy. Constantine kind of screwed that one up. So now he has a position as emperor through hereditary succession. And Maxentius is going, well, if he's going to get a position through hereditary succession, then so am I. So Maxentius, we've also talked about these emperors have legions who are very loyal to them. So they have these troops, they almost have their own armies. And that caused a lot of problems in the 3rd century because that was why this whole civil war happened for decades, because every emperor's legions were fighting all of these other potential emperors. So sort of a similar thing is going to happen. Maxentius is going to, with the help of his legions, attempt to make himself emperor, to just claim a position as emperor. And he's going to do that by fighting military campaigns, especially in Italy, and then he moves on to North Africa. And so by 311, Maxentius has essentially taken the Italian peninsula and the region of North Africa, and he has essentially taken that spot as the Augustus or Caesar, one of the emperors in the West, because that was kind of the territory of one of the Western emperors. And Licinius is also a player who enters the stage here, and Licinius is the Augustus in the West. So Severus ends up, I don't remember what happens to him, but something ends up happening to him, and they move Licinius into the Augustus in the West position. Constantine is still the Caesar in the West. So we have these two men, Licinius and Constantine, who are ruling the West, but we have this usurper also. But they're trying to make things, still peaceful. And so an opening ends up happening in the East. So Licinius is going to move to the East and become Augustus there. And that's kind of a promotion, because the Augustus in the East is kind of always like the top guy. That's kind of who you want to be. He has a little bit more power than the one in the West. So Licinius and Constantine form an alliance. Licinius actually marries Constantine's sister, so they are family now. They're all connected, right? So they can secure that they have each other's backs through these family ties that have been created. And Licinius is going to move from Augustus of the West to Augustus of the East. And that kind of gives a little bit of room for Maxentius. We're kind of acknowledging Maxentius's rule here. The issue is that Constantine and Maxentius, definite rivals, both feel they should be Augustus of the West. And that's kind of maybe an issue with the tetrarchy, is that we do have these senior and junior positions. So Constantine and Maxentius both going to claim that they're Augustus of the West, and when really one of them should be Caesar, but neither one want to be the junior emperor. They both want to be in charge. So that's going to cause some problems. What we're going to see is these problems come to a head in the year 312 at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, when Constantine is going to march with his legions against the legions of Maxentius. So Constantine is actually going to come into Italy, into Maxentius's territory, and he's going to fight Maxentius for sole control of the West. He is not saying at this point, I want to be Augustus. He's trying to take the whole West, because if he defeats Maxentius, he gets the whole West. He gets Italy, North Africa, Spain, Germany, everything. And so that's what happens. 312, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and Maxentius is defeated, and Constantine takes sole control of the West, definitely causing a breakdown in the tetrarchy. Tetrarchy, rule of 4, a little bit difficult to be the rule of 4 if you only have 3 people ruling. So that's kind of a big turning point. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge kind of changes everything, because we never go back to that tetrarchy system. We do a little bit in name only, but Constantine really takes power. Over the next 10, 12 years, tensions between Constantine and Licinius start to break down. Constantine has sort of really become the emperor of the empire, and decides that he is not content with this alliance with Licinius, ends up defeating him in battle. And in 324, Constantine now has sole control of the Roman Empire. The tetrarchy is no more, and we are back to a singular one-man emperor in Constantine. So how do we see all this unfold over the coinage, right? How can we look at the material evidence and see evidence of these events taking place? Well, we talked about the first coin, which was in the Tetrarchy era, right? So it looks pretty standard, pretty familiar to what we've seen before. After the Milvian Bridge, we're going to start to see Constantine mint new coins, and he's going to emphasize the victory of the Milvian Bridge. This is his conquest over Dacia. This is his conquest over Jerusalem that we've seen with other emperors. The Milvian Bridge is his massive victory that he's going to reference throughout his entire reign. So get used to that name. But what we see here on this gold coin, minted in Italy. So it's minted in a territory of Constantine's now. Formerly Maxentius had control of Italy. Constantine is now going to have control of it. And we see Constantine and Sol kind of both mirrored, both in profile on the obverse of the coin. So Constantine is closest to us. He's that first figure. He wears the laurel crown, so he's still got that going for him. But behind him, we have Sol, who we've talked a lot about, emperors trying to connect themselves to Sol. And we actually saw emperors during the 3rd century crisis have that radiate crown, right? Really connecting themselves, really making them that connection clear. And so what we have here is Sol himself wearing the radiate crown. And this kind of shows that Constantine, first of all, closely related to divinity, right? So definitely making those divine ties, trying to reference himself right next to a god, and look at how similar they look, like their facial features are almost identical. So there's a definite kind of attempt to make himself, in the guise of Sol, and make them look like they're almost twins, like they're one and the same. So perhaps Constantine is a little bit divine as well. But all in all, still looking like a pretty pagan ruler, right? I mean, he's got a depiction of a pagan god right there, of a Roman god, traditional Roman god on his coin. So he's clearly in line with that. However, are you ready? Because things are about to change. We also see some differences going on here. We start to see some changes. So this is actually minted the year before the gold one, okay? But we have Constantine as warrior, and we see some very different things on this coin. I mean, if you compare this to the two coins that we have on the left, you can see differences right away. He's not in profile. He's looking right at you. There's this frontal view. You see his whole face. You don't just see the side. You see him looking straight on, right? We also see a departure from these traditionally pagan forms of iconography that we've seen in the other two. So let's take a closer look. What we see, and there's a lot going on here, but one of the main things that should stick out, and for our purposes, is this symbol right here. So Constantine is dressed as a warrior. He's dressed in this military outfit. There's this shield here. Oops, there we go. Shield, and then he has this kind of elaborate helmet on. He's got his horse behind him. Looks like he has some armor on. And then in the back, we see him addressing some troops. So he's in that ad locutio pose. They're getting ready for battle, right? And this is probably referencing the Milvian Bridge, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. They're probably getting ready for that battle. But if we look closely, we see a symbol on his helmet right here. And it's hard to make out, I know. It's a little bit destroyed now. But if we look closely, it looks a little bit like that. It kind of looks like a P with an X through it. And this is actually something called the Chi Rho. This is the Chi Rho. And there's sort of a better symbol of it. And the Chi Rho is a blatantly Christian symbol, 100% Christian symbol. It represents the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. So Christos is Christ's name in Greek. You can see it written in Greek there. And in Greek, the CH of Christ is represented by an X, that's a chi. So the X that we see here is called a chi in Greek. And then what looks like a P is actually an R, if you know the Greek alphabet, and that's a rho. So we have a Chi Rho, which just means like CHR, essentially, the Chi and then the Rho. And this is also a direct reference to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So what happens at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge is that, they're camped out in outside Rome, getting ready for battle the next day. Constantine goes to sleep and has a dream of an angel, of kind of a Christian type angel. And he sees the sign of the Chi Rho. So what you see here, he sees that in the dream, and the angel tells him, with this sign, you shall conquer. With this sign, you shall conquer. Constantine wakes up and the next morning tells his troops to put this symbol on their standard, on this kind of like a flag that they're going to carry into battle, right? We talked about like the eagle that Augustus took back from the Parthians, kind of things like that. So it's like battle standard. And so he tells his troops to put the Chi Rho on this battle standard. They march into battle, and what happens? He defeats Maxentius, and he attributes this win essentially to the Christian God, to Christ. He has this moment, which is a hotly debated moment about the extent of his conversion, but it's clear that some sort of conversion takes place or change in mindset. And it's important to note that at this time, Christianity has been growing and growing. And we talked about some emperors in the 3rd century who persecuted Christians. But despite that, the population of Christians has been growing massively in the empire. So that's why there's some debate about whether or not this was a purely ideological conversion, or if there was also some political undertones to it, because Constantine was definitely helping himself out in the eyes of the populace, of his, growing and growing Christian populace, by making a connection between himself and Christianity, and by having this experience, and really not even just having the experience, but intensely displaying it, like we have on a coin here. He's referencing it. He's not trying to hide this Christian experience. He is trying to actually, advance it and demonstrate it, which is a marked change from a few decades ago when Christians were being persecuted. One of the other things that we see is right after, so the Milvian Bridge, the battle was 312. 313, perhaps as a result of this experience at the Milvian Bridge, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, which is essentially a decree that grants tolerance of Christianity, making it an accepted religion in the empire. So you can no longer be persecuted for being a Christian in the Roman Empire. It doesn't mean that we all suddenly love Christianity and we're all a Christian empire now. It just means that it's legal, essentially. It legalizes it. You can't get punished for being a Christian anymore. So a huge change that we see from just a few decades earlier, these emperors who are persecuting Christians, and a huge, huge change in something, in an empire that has been for so long so dedicated to these Roman gods, and that the role of emperor has been so closely connected to them, that the Roman emperor is essentially the head of the Roman religion. And now you have a Roman emperor who is kind of alluding to the fact that he might be a Christian. That's wow, that's definitely a change. But what are some other things that we see on this coin? So we see another element of Christian iconography. There's this staff behind him that kind of resembles a Christian cross. So another kind of allusion to Christianity here. But also on his shield, we actually see a depiction of the she-wolf and Romulus and Remus. So it's interesting because it's not quite like pagan religious iconography. It's not a goddess or a god, although they were kind of deified, but it's more a connection to Rome that he's trying to make. And so an image of a god like Sol has kind of been replaced by sort of a more general image of Rome. So still marking himself as a Roman emperor and still closely tying himself to Rome's past, but not necessarily outright its pagan past, sort of its more mythical national history in a way. So we see Romulus and Remus and the she-wolf there. And then just in terms of style, also, this should really strike you for being a piece of late antique art. So we see those bulging eyes that we've seen in like the Fayum portraits and the Severins, those eyes that are characteristic of late antiquity, sort of an abstraction of the face, especially, I'm going to go back here for a second. We don't see a huge degree of naturalism on coins in general. It's just kind of hard to render that on coins also. But if you compare these look much more classical. They sort of have that idealized serenity to them. And here we have a frontal pose. So he's looking right at you. These bulging eyes. I wouldn't say it's very idealized. You can like see his under eye bags. He's got these kind of like huge lips. So definitely a different scene. And then on the back, we also have a really crowded scene, kind of like we've seen on some of the sarcophagi and stuff, horror vacui, they got to fill the space. And then also a little bit of shorter figures, so they're not as quite elongated as this figure is, although we still have the contrapposto, but these ones I'm kind of looking at are a little bit squatter maybe. So interesting, again, oops, I tried to go back. 316, 315. The point that I want to make here is that Constantine is not fully a pagan, is not fully a Christian. He's able to play both sides. He's able to appeal to everyone in the empire, right? He's issuing coins that are representing himself as members of two different religions. So definitely trying to, in his role as emperor, create cohesion, appeal to everyone, relate to everyone that's in the kingdom, basically. And just to point also that when you think about the change from the Roman religion to Christianity moving forward, even into the Middle Ages, just remember that this is not a smooth transition. This doesn't happen at once. Although we have the Edict of Milan being issued in 313, that does not mean that the empire is suddenly Christian. There are still huge swaths of people in both sides. So Constantine, through these coins, he's trying to appeal to both of those sides. Moving on a little bit now, if we look at his portraiture. So I want you to notice, right? So notice that face there, those bulging eyes, those kind of big lips, the frontally oriented face, and you can really see that carried over into something as massive as a colossal portrait here. So this head is about 5 feet tall, I think. Yeah, 5'9.5", so almost 6, kind of. This is a little bit later in his reign, but it's a colossal portrait. So if you remember, you know, the Colossus of Nero, something like that, it's kind of the same idea that you have this massive, larger than life statue where his head is the size of, you know, his head is taller than I am. And we see a consistent portraiture here. So we see him looking like he did on the coin. So there's definitely a degree of individualization here. We're not the tetrarchy where we all look the same on that portrait, where he really has a distinct look to him. What else do we see? So we see, again, those bulging eyes. We see some realism here. We don't see a super idealized face. He's got lines under his eyes. He's got them kind of drooping in his mouth. He has this cleft chin, as you can see. It's very a prominent chin. He's got the eyebrows, kind of bushy eyebrows in a way. He doesn't have a beard, so that's a big one. If we remember, kind of the last person that we looked at was Diocletian. His statue head, which he still had the beard, he was still continuing that tradition that had been started by Hadrian and really taken up by almost everyone ever since. So Constantine is not going to have a beard. He's going to be clean shaven. And he also kind of has this bowl cut. And this might kind of be a little bit more of a Trajanic trait. And we know that Trajan was inspired by Augustus, so you could even say maybe it's more of an Augustan trait, but we'll see a couple things that kind of connect Constantine to Trajan. There's a few ways, and the first that I mentioned was actually the Aula Palatina, the wooden roof that was the same as the Basilica Ulpia, which is in Trajan's Forum in Rome. So we kind of see him definitely noticing Trajanic works of architecture, works of art, and he's kind of going to adopt a similar bowl cut, not exactly the same, but similar-ish to these two men. Also, he just kind of looks like Sylvester Stallone to me. I will never get over that. I remember sitting in an undergrad class and having a professor say that, and that has stuck with me ever since, every time I see this. We'll also see as time goes on that he's going to age a little bit, so he starts to get more and more bags under his eyes. But overall, if we look at his picture compared to the other two men, Augustus is our model of classical portraiture. Trajan is definitely going to adopt similar portraiture, similar styles in sort of a classical naturalistic sense, but we don't see that mirrored in Constantine's picture. So Constantine's going to look a little bit more abstracted, not as idealized, as I said, not as classical in the sense that his head is much more blocky, where the other two men kind of have these like long necks and quite thin faces, and their hair is close. Everything's kind of trying to be elongated, trying to be elegant. We have a little bit more blockiness on Constantine's picture here. We have some more geometric features. So those eyes are kind of a shape. They're almost like I could imagine how they were drawn as a shape. Same with his eyebrows. They're kind of just these like two little arches. So we see some kind of stylization, abstraction here a little bit, not as naturalistic as the other two men. Something else to point out is that his eyes, they are drilled, but the other thing to mention is that they are looking upward. So he's looking up toward the heavens. Augustus and Trajan are going to be looking out over their troops, commanding their empire, and Constantine is looking up toward heaven, and you have to wonder kind of to what deity is he looking toward? Is he imagining that he's looking toward the Christian god or the Roman pantheon? And I would argue that it's likely the Christian god, especially we're at 336 now, so he's likely looking up in sort of a more sort of trying to assert that kind of Christian connection in his life again with those eyes, sort of pious eyes. A similar portrait can be found in the Colossus of Constantine. So this is a marble sculpture, unlike this one, which was bronze, I believe. But this one is going to be mostly marble, although we'll talk about a little bit in a second about some other things that you see. But the Colossus of Constantine. So today it's at the Capitoline Museum, and it's in all of these jumbled parts, essentially. So we have his head pretty intact. We also have his finger. His finger's kind of going like that, pointing upward maybe. We have parts of his arms, and then we have parts of his feet. Also, this is also a huge statue. You can see in my own photo here how I compare to it. So it's about probably the same. It's maybe, actually no, I think this one's much bigger. Yeah, this one's 8 feet. The other one was 5'9". This one's 8 feet. So much larger. The entire statue probably would have stood 40 feet tall, and he actually would have been seated. So it would have been a seated portrait. Again, we see a high degree of individualization here. So he looks like himself. He looks like Constantine. Those bulging eyes again, the cleft chin, the kind of just semicircle eyebrows, that bowl cut. You know, there's a lot of similarities there. This one's a little bit earlier. This is going to be right after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So he might look a little bit younger, maybe a little bit more idealized, you know, kind of that heroic young male here, because he actually is younger here. So about 20 years younger, maybe. Again, we see these huge bulging eyes that are really characteristic of the late antique period, and we see them also looking up. So he's sort of divinely inspired, maybe. Perhaps he is looking to a power that's actually higher than himself. He's actually you know, he's in deference to someone. He's not the greatest power. Maybe he's maybe has some divine approval, but maybe he is sort of looking up toward another power. We also see these eyes as kind of almost windows to the soul here, you know, the way that they're rendered. You get the sense that a lot is going on in his inner world, right? That he's deep in thought, he's sort of looking up, looking off, thinking about something maybe. So definitely sort of a spiritual aspect to this portrait. And just to remind you again of some late antique works, these trends that we see, again, those eyes, you know, windows to the soul, these bulging eyes that are really the focus of each one of these portraits, characteristic of the late antique style. And it's really interesting, I think, how we can see it in different media. So we see it in the Fayum portraits, in the picture of Severin, which were both painted on wood. We see it in coins, so in metal, and then we also see it here in marble and stone. So they're using the same kind of trends, but they're distributing them across media, right? So these different types of media, each medium is using the same kind of technique or same type of trend. And on the topic of medium, this actually was an acrolith. So that's kind of a new vocab word for you, an acrolith. It means a statue that is made of more than one material. So it's kind of a composite of multiple materials. And that's also a thought about why we don't have his whole body, right? And we only have kind of different parts, you know, his head and his feet and his, you know, finger, is maybe because some of it was done in metal or wood. This is kind of a reconstruction, not sure if it's true or not, you know, how accurate it is. But maybe he was wearing sort of a cloak over the middle of his body that was gilt bronze. And so that no longer exists because it was likely melted down later, but we still have the marble pieces. And as I said, yeah, it would have been a huge, huge statue. You can kind of see its comparison with a door here. So, you know, think of something like the Lincoln Memorial in DC, right? Like the way that Lincoln is like giant in that, that's a Colossus statue. So it's kind of the same feeling, the same idea if you've been there. And it would have stood in a basilica. So this is our kind of next work here. It has a lot of names, so you can call it the Basilica of Maxentius, Basilica of Constantine, Basilica Nova. They all mean the same thing. I'm going to call it the Basilica of Maxentius just because, I don't know, we got to pick one. But it was actually started under Maxentius. So that's where that name comes from. Maxentius, while he was still emperor of Italy and North Africa, prior to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, begins this massive, massive basilica in the Roman Forum. So he is trying to copy the emperors who came before him and make his mark on the Roman city. And we see it here. So look at that. We've filled out the whole map. If you, I don't know if you look back at the PowerPoints, you'll see that I like whited some things out because we hadn't gotten there yet. But now I can give you the whole map. So here is the Roman Forum. This is the Forum Romanum. And you can see the Forum of Trajan over here, Augustus, Julius Caesar, Vespasian. South of that, or actually I think this is, sorry, this is east, I think, is the Basilica of Maxentius. And so it's also on the Sacred Way. And then over here, if we kept going, the Colosseum would be over here. So it'd be kind of like even more east. But a lot of it exists today. So as you can see, it is a huge, massive structure. It's one of the biggest things you notice if you go to the Roman Forum today, because it is so huge and a lot of it still survives. If we look a little bit closer at the plan, so that kind of reconstruction of the Colossus of Constantine, you can kind of see here. So it was a basilica. So it's going to be set up like a basilica. It's a long rectangular building, and then it has an apse in the west. And that is where Constantine's statue would have been. And then when he, sorry, I should back up a little bit. So Maxentius started this, right? Started it in 306. when he is defeated by Constantine at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine's going to come in and take over this building and kind of re-vet it a little bit for his own uses. So that's when that statue is going to get placed there. He's going to mark himself as the new emperor, right? He is the new focus of this building. It's even thought that maybe part of the Colossus was actually recarved into Constantine from Maxentius. So there might have been a Colossus of Maxentius that used to be there, and then Constantine comes in and builds his own. So a massive statue of Constantine in the apse in that western end, and then Constantine likely would have sat below it and maybe received guests kind of like the Aula Palatina, right? Because he's coming back to Rome. So he had Trier as his imperial headquarters when he was emperor in the West, but now he's emperor of the whole West, right? And so he's going to come back to Rome and make that kind of his new home, his new imperial headquarters. So what else do we see? If we look a little bit more at the architecture, so it's made up of a bunch of barrel vaults, essentially. So we have a large, long aisle that's the center of the basilica. And then on either side, there's these barrel vaults. And if we look a little bit closer, you can see these are all different reconstructions, kind of trying to figure out what it looked like. But a lot of basilicas that we looked at had colonnades. So right here, they would have had a row of columns. And instead, we kind of have these columns and then arches. So it opens up the space a ton. It makes it feel much more open and larger also. So there's really an emphasis on the size, the grandeur of this giant open space. The roof in the middle likely would have been groin vaults. And then, as I said, the barrel vaults that are in those kind of archways. What else do we have here? So yeah, really just a huge building, probably the largest basilica in the Roman world. There we have a depiction of Constantine again. And here is it today. So also you can see a coffered ceiling up top. Also kind of creating some depth, opening up the space so you don't just have a solid roof. This is one side of it. So this is kind of what we're going to call the nave, sort of the open space in the middle. And then Constantine would have sat at the end here. And then we have this is the one side of it. So this is kind of the open nave, and then this is a side of the building. So basilicas have just kind of gotten bigger and grander ever since. You know, if you compare this to the one at Pompeii or something, or even earlier ones in Rome, we really start to see them expand as a form and expand their function too. So huge building here. Elsewhere in Rome, so kind of nearby, as I said, Constantine coming back from Trier, his imperial headquarters in the northwest, he's going to come in and kind of start to redo things in Rome. So he's going to try to make his mark on the Roman city. He does that first by reclaiming the basilica from Maxentius and putting his own name on it. He's also going to build a triumphal arch. So this is the Arch of Constantine. It dates to around the same time. So right after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, right after he becomes kind of sole emperor, essentially. And it's right by the Colosseum. So this is the Colosseum today. And then there is the Arch of Constantine. Here's a reconstruction of it in the Roman period. You can see that there's the Colossus of Nero, right? It's not Nero anymore because he got like damnatio memoriae. And so he's his soul now. We have the sun god's soul. And then Constantine is going to build his arch kind of right next to all of these things. And then the Roman Forum sort of over here. This is one of my favorite monuments, and it's largely because it really encapsulates everything we've talked about in this class. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time on it, pretty much the rest of class on this one. So if we look closer, this arch is largely made of spolia. And I don't think we've talked about that term yet. Maybe you've heard it in some of your other classes. Spolia is essentially reused material. So if a building falls down or doesn't want to be used anymore, you know, they don't want to use it anymore, they might take the materials from it, because those are perfectly good materials, and use them on another building. And this is, spolia is kind of a general term for reused material, but we see it really commonly in the late antique and medieval Byzantine worlds, where they especially use ancient material in their buildings at that time. So that's what we see here. Constantine is going to go through Rome, essentially, and take all of these works of art from other emperors and put them on his own arch. So we have this typical, you first look at it, it looks like a very typical Roman triumphal arch, three-bayed, that flat top probably would have had a sculpture on top, but it's not a completely Constantinian work of art. So we're going to kind of go through all of the different things, the different people who we see represented here. And this also, as a triumphal arch, as a victory monument, is going to be referencing the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, because as I said, that was Constantine's big victory. So it also, you might notice, looks a little bit similar to the Arch of Septimius Severus in the Roman Forum. So this is kind of the new trend, this triple bayed arch for Roman triumphal arches. It has an inscription. So if we look first here at the middle, this dedication inscription, it says, "For the Emperor Caesar Flavius Constantine the Greatest, pious blessed Augustus, because by inspiration of divinity and greatness of his mind, from a tyrant on one side and from every faction of all on the other side at once, with his army he avenged the Republic with just arms. The Senate and the Roman people dedicated this arch as a sign for his triumphs." So this is a celebration of Constantine's victory, and I've bolded the word faction there because we see the word faction being used somewhere else, and that is actually at the Res Gestae of Augustus, where he says, "In my 19th year, blah, 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 I raised an army with which I set free the state, which was oppressed by the domination of a faction." And he is, of course, referencing Mark Antony. And so we have two people who were basically fighting civil wars against these enemies, and they're going to call them a faction. So this might be a sort of reference to maybe Augustus, maybe a reference that Constantine has accomplished as great a feat as Augustus did, and restored the same sort of peace to the empire after fighting kind of a civil war type thing. So that's the inscription. If we look closer at the sculptural program, so what we see are pieces of spolia taken primarily from 3 other emperors, and these are 3 of the 5 good emperors. So it's also thought that Constantine is not just trying to take spolia of anyone. He's not trying to connect himself to anyone or reference anyone. He's trying to reference specifically really good emperors who people liked, who had really good reputations. One of those being Trajan, who we've already seen him reference in his portraiture and in his basilica. So he's kind of got he's a fan of these men, right? And the 3 are going to be Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. And you can see them represented here. So we're going to kind of go through those in order. So the first is Trajan. So where we see spolia from the reign of Trajan is in these sculptures up here, these statues who are standing there. And those are actually Dacian prisoners. So they probably date to around 112 after Trajan's campaign in Dacia. And if we compare them to the figures on the column of Trajan, you'll see a lot of similarities. So these statues, these barbarians who have their arms folded like they're bound, this one is marked kind of by a different hat, they're dressed a little bit differently than Romans. They've got the beard, which in Trajan's era was definitely a sign of foreignness. But look at this man's face compared to this man's face. I mean, they almost look like the same person. So this is definitely dated to the reign of Trajan, was probably taken from somewhere else in the city and reused here on the Arch of Constantine, still with the same message, still with the same kind of message of domination, of conquering enemies, right? So the message is the same, but Constantine's going to take Trajan's and incorporate it into his own. Next up is the roundels of Hadrian. So these ones, these circles with scenes in them are called roundels. Each one is one roundel. So these on the south side of the arch, we see them. So these 2 are the 2 over here, and then these ones are those. So we have scenes of hunting. So Hadrian departing for a hunt, making a sacrifice. And then on the other side, similar scenes. So we have 2 hunt scenes and 2 sacrifice scenes. So on the other side, it's a bear hunt and a sacrifice to a different god. And what we actually see is that Constantine has recarved the face of Hadrian into his own face. So it's Hadrian's body with Constantine's face on it, essentially. Whether this is laziness or, reference, maybe trying to pay tribute, it's honestly probably a bit of each, that he wanted to use works of art that already existed, but also was trying to reference leaders who he really respected. and trying to reference that he is sort of the newest iteration of these. So that's on this side, common scenes that we've seen before: hunting, sacrifices, common for emperors. And then on the north side, we actually have these porphyry roundels. Well, the roundels are stone, but this porphyry purple stone behind it, which we talked about when we talked about the portrait of the Tetrarchy, purple as a sign of royalty. So we have this porphyry stone, which who knows where he got that, with these Hadrianic roundels. Again, we have the aftermath of a lion hunt. So another reference, you can see the lion lying deceased there. And then we have a sacrifice to Hercules. So kind of interesting because these are both maybe Herculean references. So the aftermath of a lion hunt, we've talked a lot about Hercules killing the Nemean lion and then taking its pelt. So sort of a reference there. And then on the other side, probably a sacrifice to Hercules, who is likely seated up top there. And so again, it makes sense because these are things that Hadrian might have depicted himself as, being a Grecophile, being interested in Hercules. This is something that we're seeing from his iconography being repurposed on the Arch of Constantine. And again, kind of recarving the faces, recutting them to look like Constantine. And then if we move forward to Marcus Aurelius's representations here, so that's going to be on top on those relief panels. And on this side, we have the presentation of a client king, so like another king, a foreign enemy, probably king, and then receiving barbarian prisoners. So it's similar, they kind of go together, that they're receiving a king and then receiving prisoners. All of this same kind of messaging of domination, of conquest, all of that. And then on the other side, we have also, again, more similar or standard imperial imagery. So giving an address, that ad locutio pose, we see him standing here with some troops below listening, and then making a sacrifice before a battle. So trying to win some favor before you go out and battle. And you see all those standards. You can see what I was talking about, these kind of flags that they carried into battle, all these battle standards. So those are the references to other emperors here, trying to, again, reference those who came before him, but maybe also, kind of just have a little bit of an easier time, not having to carve everything anew, and you can just carve the face and make yourself, look like Constantine. So there's evidence that the faces have been recarved. On the other side, similar things as well. So we see an arrival into Rome and then leaving Rome, which would have been Marcus Aurelius depicted there originally. And then on the other side, distribution of largesse. So that's kind of charity giving that we've seen, and the submission of barbarian prisoners. So basically, this is all standard imperial imagery, very typical for triumphal arches. Something you will notice, though, is that it does not ever depict a triumphal procession. So that's the one thing it's missing. We have all this standard imperial iconography, but there is no reference to a triumphal procession. And we've seen that. That's kind of a thing that you do. You always have to reference the procession that's taking place on the arch that the procession is taking place through, right? It gets really meta. We don't see that here. What we see, though, the last thing is Constantine's original contribution. And so that's going to be on these friezes, these kind of thinner friezes, in between the archway and the roundels. And we see battle scenes, and we see a lot. This is where the primary reference, besides the inscription, comes in to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So we see his troops marching over there on the west side. This is actually kind of on the end of it. So if you think of it as kind of like a little bit of a cube, the short end, that's like where this frieze is. And then on this side is this siege of Verona, which is another city in Italy, a little bit more in the north. And so maybe as Constantine was coming with his troops to the city of Rome, to the Battle of Maxentius, or to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he clashed with Maxentius's troops outside Verona. And so we see a depiction of that battle here. And then on the other side, we see the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So over here, right here is the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, what we're looking at right there. And then on that eastern side, that short side, is going to be Constantine entering Rome. And that is a significant moment for him because he's just defeated Maxentius. So he's just taken control of the empire, and he is going to enter Rome. So that's a little bit like a triumphal procession in a way, but not exactly. We don't see the arch taking place there. And it's sort of just him marching with his troops. We don't really see the same kind of representations of like booty, of like war, things that he's taken, gifts and things. It's sort of a little bit more militaristic here, although we do see Constantine in a four-horse chariot, which is pretty standard. So on the other side, so this is the north side, we start to see him as an emperor. So before, we kind of saw him fighting for control, and then we see him defeating Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, entering Rome, and now he's emperor on the north side. So we see him giving an imperial address at the Forum, which is marked by sort of architecture that we can recognize. So it's setting the scene here. These arches, which might be the Basilica of Maxentius, something like that. We see architecture back there, marking it as the Forum. And then over here, the distribution of largesse by Constantine. This is an original frieze. So we saw it from Marcus Aurelius, I think it was. And then now we see Constantine actually creating this himself. So this, it's sort of chronological, I guess you could say, but it's not like one integrated narrative. It's not telling one story. It's not just one triumphal procession, and everything you're seeing is different bits of those triumphal processions. Like over here you see some troops holding a menorah, and then over here you see Titus and his chariot, and it's like all the same scene. It's much more kind of almost chaotic, like there's lots of different things going on, lots of different scenes, and especially when you start to bring in the other emperors, there's just a ton of different scenes going on. It's not one narrative here. It's not really, and it's a little bit of an episodic narrative, but it's not really, because it's not like in order. It's kind of all over the place. So a bit more chaotic. And then a couple other things that we see that I didn't point out specifically, but in these spandrels, we see some depictions of victory, various personifications. So we see river gods, Mars, Roma, one of the Roman people, Sol in a chariot, and Luna descending. So those are all other Constantine originals. So you'll notice that there's some pagan imagery there, right? So again, he's not strictly a Christian at this point. He's sort of playing both sides, and especially maybe on something so public in the city of Rome, he's not quite ready to declare Christianity yet. He's still going to make a lot of pagan references. But if we do some comparison, so looking a little bit more formally at the arch, if we take that distribution of largesse that was original to Constantine, and we compare it to the distribution of largesse on the Anaglypha Traiani, which is from the Roman Forum under Trajan, it's the same scene, right? So it's both emperors distributing charity, but it's rendered in very different ways. And that's something we've been talking a lot about, this change in sculpture in the late antique period. So in Trajan's, we see very classical figures. We see this long sweeping drapery, very elongated figures. So they seem tall. There's sort of a verticality to all of the figures. It does share similarities in that we have the architecture marking the scene and the same scene itself, but it is very classical in nature. And we saw that also with Trajan's portrait. If we compared Trajan's portrait, it looked a lot like Augustus, which looks a lot like the classical period. In Constantine's, though, it looks very late antique. So we don't have these tall, elegant, vertical figures. They're much more short and squat. They're also much more abstracted. So we don't see the same degree of naturalism to the body. The body is a little bit more cartoonish, maybe. It doesn't look quite as much like it could just walk off of the panel. Something else that we see is the way that each emperor is sitting. So Trajan is here, he's seated here, and he's receiving these people around him. And if you look, he's kind of in a three-quarter view in a way. I'll try to imitate it, where you can see his whole body, right? So you can see like the width of his chest from shoulder to shoulder, but he's kind of, that part's turned towards you, and then his legs are turned toward the person that he is giving the charity to. So it kind of almost looks like he was just talking to this person, and then he kind of posed for a picture. So it's a much more almost profile three-quarter view. Constantine, however, is fully frontal. He is, you can see both of his knees like pointing towards you. His feet are facing you. They're not facing the people around him. And he is looking right out into space. And that's a big difference that we've seen also, this difference in frontality, and that classical portraiture or classical sculpture is much more interactive. You see people in profile talking to one another, but in Constantine's kind of late antique style, it's very frontal. And you see that there's all these people around him, and they're all looking at him, and he is gazing outward. So we see this separation that started under the Severans, where we see a separation between the emperor and the people, that they're not all interacting anymore. It's the emperor and then the people. There's a bit of a separation that frontality creates. And I just want to make one more point, that idea about frontality is a little bit more of reminiscent of something that a king might do rather than the emperor that is derived from a republic. And so if you think about Augustus, he was the princeps. He was the first among the people. He was the first citizen, but he was still a citizen. And that's just another difference that I kind of want to make here, especially when we look forward, and when we really look forward into the medieval period and the rise of kings. That there's a difference there. The king is not just one of the citizens. They are on a throne and they are separate. And if you also think about Constantine's depictions in, say, his basilicas of his Colossus, that's the same thing. He's in that apse, he's the center of attention, everyone's looking at him, and he is this giant kind of focal point. So we're seeing this change from an emperor who was one of the people, you know, kind of part of the republic, and now he's the emperor, but we still don't like kings back then. We're starting to move toward another model of kingship that will emerge in Europe in the medieval period. So just to summarize, again, here's another example from Marcus Aurelius. I've said this a lot, but just to hammer home again, the classical on the left, these elongated forms, a really detailed attention to drapery, to the way that garments are rendered, to the movement, the contrapposto pose that you see, the idealized facial expressions, and the references to Greece, like we have this flying figure, you know, lots of references to classical Greece. Versus late antique, also called italic art, the shorter, squatter figures. The drapery is not as detailed. It's much shallower. You just see these lines, right? That's not the same treatment as this. Look at the complexity there compared to the more simple abstraction of this. We see some real differences. So if this is still not clear to you after everything that I've said, I really encourage you to go read the textbook as well, because they lay it out very well. So if you're not quite sure about this still, this is really important. So make sure that you've got this down. So that is going to do it for the Arch of Constantine. And what we're seeing here is a radical change in sculpture. And not just in the Roman period, but if you think back all the way to classical Greece, you know, these are norms that we've seen ever since. And so starting here in the 4th century, and we started a little bit before that as well, but this is just a radical change in sculpture, and it's one that's going to persist through the medieval period. So this kind of same sort of abstracted forms where you are not looking very classical, it's going to move forward into the medieval period. So it's really setting a stage for a new era. And similar to how we see these radical changes in relief sculpture, in statuary, we are also going to see radical changes coming in architecture. And that's going to come in the form of the end of pagan temples and the beginning of Christian churches. So next time, we're going to look at churches that Constantine builds in the city of Rome, whose forms look different, but both of whom are going to come to define not only the city of Rome, but all of church construction, Christian church construction moving forward across the Mediterranean, across Europe. So clearly a time of massive change, late antiquity, and especially happening under Constantine. So that was kind of the political side, Constantine's rise to power, how he represents himself through statuary, through political imagery. Next time, we're going to look more at early Christianity, both the art and the architecture. That's going to be woven in with Constantine, but we're also going to take a greater look at his early Christianity in general and how this really changes the Roman Empire. So that's going to be our last lecture. I'll see you then.